Welcome. 10 Boom Institute review on The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I've got a little classic hardback classics collector's version of this. It's a short story, and there's other short stories in here by Robert Louis Stevenson. So it's only just this very first part of this book. There's not much to it. You really can read it in a couple hours. It's probably one of his most famous writings, and rightfully so. I really love it. I've used it in a lot of classes, and I do it in conjunction. Often we'll read and discuss this short story along with a play called A Man for All Seasons, which there's another review on that one as well. Because there's some similarities and some good comparisons you can do. So if you want a fun read for 1 month in your book group or with your family, you could read this short story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and A Man for All Seasons together and discuss the similarities. Conscience is a huge theme for both of these books. That's one of the things that's interesting to discuss them together. Also, there's a man called Richard Rich who actually was a real person in A Man for All Seasons, and his development as he becomes more evil in that book, and of course Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde become more evil in this book, and so you can make some really good, interesting comparisons. So this is a short story, and the premise of the book is that Dr. Jekyll is a doctor. It's interesting because when movies have been done, Jekyll, because it's kind of a creepy name, often is the one that's portrayed as Jekyll is the bad guy. It's not true. Jekyll is the good guy. It's the doctor. And Mr. Hyde, which is Hyde, but it's kind of a symbolic name because he doesn't want to be seen. He's the bad guy. So what happens is Dr. Jekyll has always, he says even from the time that he was going to medical school, he kind of lived this double life because he knew that he should behave certain ways in society and be respectable as a doctor and live according to his class in society. This is in Britain, and so there's an aristocratic society. I think it's about turn of the 20th century is kind of meant to be the time frame. Maybe late 1800s, I'm not positive. And Dr. Jekyll doesn't like that. He kind of has this secret life that he lives, and he says at the beginning it wasn't really bad. He didn't do lots of really bad things, but he liked to kind of be a playboy on the side. And so then eventually he had this grand idea that he was going to make a potion and he was going to separate his nature. He was going to have Dr. Jekyll be the good guy and Mr. Hyde be the bad guy. And Mr. Hyde, nobody would know who he was, and he would kind of be anonymous. He would have a different house, which Dr. Jekyll got him a different house, and he had a different name, and Dr. Jekyll made sure that Mr. Hyde had access to money so he could do things he wanted to do, and he could run off and be wild and crazy and get in trouble, and it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't affect Dr. Jekyll, and he could just become Dr. Jekyll again whenever he wanted. Like, that was the idea. And it worked wonderfully for a while. He was able to have his cake and eat it too. He was able to be Mr. Hyde and go out and do really what became more and more horrible stuff. And Dr. Jekyll could just turn back into Dr. Jekyll, and he could have, the fun of his respectable doctor life, and nobody would make the connection. Except there's this character that we're introduced to at the beginning. It's kind of interesting how Stevenson wrote it, because he wrote it from the perspective of somebody else who's looking on, and you only get the first-hand story from Jekyll in the last section, which is an extensive letter that Jekyll writes right before he dies to tell his own story in his own words. So it's kind of as a mystery. Mr. Utterson is Dr. Jekyll's attorney, and Dr. Jekyll has come to him and said, there's this guy, Mr. Hyde, and I want him to inherit all my stuff when I die, if I die. And it's a really strange arrangement, and it's made Mr. Utterson feel really uncomfortable from the beginning. And so he's kind of watching it, and then some things develop over time, and Utterson meets up with this other guy, that they go on walks, and then they see Mr. Hyde, and the conversation comes up, and so Mr. Utterson has this is kind of warned, like, Mr. Hyde isn't a very good guy, so he tries to convince Jekyll to change his mind. And so the story develops. I think one of the reasons that this story is so timeless, that it continues to be pretty popular, is partly because of how Stevenson wrote it as a mystery, and the story unfolds and you're not sure what's really going on, and you don't know until the end that it's this, that he's both guys, and that it's this potion that he's created to be a good and a bad guy. And even though I'm telling you that, and it seems like maybe it's a spoiler going into it, you kind of know the plot now. It's not at all. It's not going to ruin it at all, because the story's going to unfold, and you're going to see all the details of how this. It's not so much that you go into this short story, and one of the reasons it's a classic is because it's worth reading over and over again. Because even when you know the story, it's still marvelous. In fact, it's more marvelous. Because then you can dissect, well then, how did it become that way? And what decisions did Jekyll make? And what does that have to do with me? And this message, this central message that you can't play with fire. It's the same kind of story and message as A Picture of Dorian Gray, which is also worth reading, and we'll have a review on that one. But this short story teaches a lot about this idea of playing with evil, of playing with fire, of trying to have your cake and eat it too, of wanting to be two people. Now, we're all that way a little bit, and I think that's one of the messages, is we should try to root that out of ourselves as much as we possibly can, and not be hypocrites, and not be the person that says one thing and does another, or tries to hide certain behavior. That's an indication. If I do something and I don't want anybody to find out, that's an indication. And that starts with young children. If you're going to read this with your family and have a discussion on it, or with a book group, that's a valuable lesson even for young children. When you do something and you feel bad inside and you want to hide it from people, you're destroying your own conscience and your own nature, bit by bit, small thing by small thing. There's one of my students was talking about in one of the discussions, this Cherokee legend that this grandfather tells this young Cherokee Indian about the two wolves that are raging inside all of us. And that's what this story brings out really well, is this internal struggle that we all have. And so after they've talked about this for a little bit, this little boy says to the grandpa, he says, well, who will win? Which wolf is going to win of these wolves that are raging inside us? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. And I love that. It really has a lot to do with, biblically, there's Lot's wife who wants to be in Sodom and out of Sodom. That's where her heart is. And that's scriptural, we're told that a lot in the Bible. What you prize, what you think about, what you're really, really about is what you're going to become. And that's the message here. What did Dr. Jekyll really want? Well, he really wanted to be Mr. Hyde. And he talks about that. One of my very favorite parts is near the end, when he loses control. He always, to this point, could control when he became Mr. Hyde or not. And when he's finally gone too far and he's let himself run wild again, and Hyde has committed murder, and he tries to be good for a little while, it's really not who he really is. He says, there comes an end to all things, the most capacious measure is filled at last, and this brief condescension to evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. And yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days, because that's who he really was. And then he talks about how he begins comparing himself to other people, even though and he keeps trying to distance himself from Mr. Hyde and pretend like that's not really who he is, and not take full responsibility for the fact that he created Mr. Hyde and he's completely responsible for all Hyde's behavior. Anyway, it's really, there's so many wonderful things about guilt and responsibility and conscience and evil that are very valuable themes to read and discuss from this short story. I love it. I will say it's a little bit older writing, so it's a little bit older language. You probably are going to have to look up a few words and go a little bit more slowly. It's worth it. The language is beautiful, and because it's a short story, it's a great one to practice on, getting yourself accustomed to that kind of language so that you can move toward reading some good 19th century literature and some Shakespeare and all that good stuff eventually. So it's a good starting place for getting used to older language. Anyway, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, love it. Enjoy. We'll see you next time.